Well, we start a new series today called The Elephant in the Family Room. You've likely heard this term used before, and it really means a major problem or controversial issue that is obvious and presented in front of everyone, and yet it's avoided as a subject for discussion because it's not comfortable to do so. As we work through this series over the next number of weeks, we're going to be talking about Jesus' view of family, loneliness, marriage, and family history. And our passage to ponder, which we'll dig into a little bit each week as we go through this, I want to read it with you, for you today, is found in 1 Peter 4, 7, 8. It says this: "The end of all things is near, therefore be alert and be of sober mind so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins." There are some family issues that we just don't like to talk about. If you watched the movie Encanto, you've likely heard the song, "We Don't Talk About Bruno," and I could sing it for you today, but I won't. In my family, we don't talk about Linda because I was the fourth child out of three boys ahead of me, and I was supposed to be a girl, and my mom was going to call me Linda, but another boy came into the world out of that. Sonia and I don't talk about the name Madison because, interestingly enough, when Sonia was pregnant with our third, the first ultrasound, they told us that it was going to be a girl. And so we went out and we bought a dress. And then when we went for the second ultrasound that we had, Sonia said, "Can you just confirm that it's a girl?" And they said, "No, actually, it's a boy." And so we had this time where we had to go through and realize it was going to be a boy. And we went through that. And interestingly enough, when Quentin, our youngest, was born, I came home one day and Quentin was dressed in the dress that we had bought for him. And I thought for the moment that Sonia was sort of losing it. She said, "I had to put him in the dress just for the sake of using it." Sometimes in our families, when we go through things and things don't happen as expected, we grieve. And part one of our series today that we're going through is we're going to talk about grieving what we didn't have. Family loss and grief are at epidemic levels. The mental health crisis we're going through, statistics have come out that by the age of 40, likely 1 in 2 people will have experienced mental illness. 2020 stats tell us that 11 people commit suicide in Canada each day. Substance and opioid addiction. It's some of the stats that come out for that are 67,000 deaths attributed to abuse and substance abuse each year. Then there is the loss of a family member or a friend, a parent, a sibling, a child. Now, I've heard parents say no parent should ever have to bury their child. And the loss of those people in our lives, it was just a few weeks ago that I was actually at a funeral for a fellow pastor. And another pastor that I knew came up to me and told me about this gentleman who I actually had worked with as an electrician and had spent time with, was actually a part of our church that we had planted, that he had recently passed away from COVID. These things happen around us all the time, these family loss and grief. Then there is the deconstruction of faith. It's popular and really these days, and what it means is a crisis of faith that leads to either a reevaluation or even abandonment of faith. And sometimes for those who go through this, there's a spiraling into destructive cynicism and self-righteous judgment, or deconversion as they call it, really walking away from the faith. And then there's the epidemic of estrangement. Broken relationships and divorce. Those family members who feel like that their life is better without their spouse or their parents or siblings in their lives. Carl Pilmer from the Cornell Family Reconciliation Project did some research and discovered that 20% of American adults are estranged right now. And I can speak for Sonny and I. We're actually going through the same thing with a family member of ours. And then there is personal regret and guilt. Those who secretly have gone through abortion or have had affairs and have never told anyone about it. Or people have made life choices and they're still experiencing the consequences of those choices. I remember sitting in a coffee shop and I overheard someone's conversation one day, and the person said, "I don't think that my spouse will ever forgive me for that decision that I've made." For some, loss and grief is like a bad dream where you look in the mirror and there's this big hole in the middle of you and you don't know what to do with it, and you're experiencing trauma at that moment because of that loss and then grief. I want to tell you today that God knows about grief. Specifically, Jesus, who is God in the flesh, who came as a man, experienced grief. We see this happening in the Garden of Gethsemane, which we hear about in Matthew 26, as well as other passages in Mark and Luke, and also in Hebrews chapter 7. In Mark 26, Jesus and the disciples they have just had the Last Supper together, and Jesus is headed to the cross, and at this moment in the evening, they head to the Garden of Gethsemane, and it says in the passage there that he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." As we continue to read, one of the gospel accounts says that he sweat like great drops of blood because of the agony that he was going through. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 5:7 says this, that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. These words that are used in these Bible passages for Jesus' response really describe him as in distress, as under severe mental strain, and almost to the point of depression regarding what was to come. He was going to bear the sin of the world and be all alone on the cross, and it put him into grief. Another experience that we read about in the life of Jesus was on the edge of Jerusalem. In Luke 19:41-44, Jesus was traveling from the Mount of Olives towards Jerusalem, and it's Palm Sunday. The people the crowds are there, and they're celebrating. They're saying, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." They're putting down palm branches and coats for Jesus to come along as he rides along in a donkey, and it's called the triumphal entry. And it says in these verses, "As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, 'If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. They will not leave one stone on another,'" speaking about the city of Jerusalem, "because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." The words used for Jesus' response in this passage refer to a mourning and a lamenting over what might have been. Instead of belief in him, they would be rejecting him only hours after this would happen in the weeks to come. And then there's the experience at Lazarus' tomb. And I want to focus in on this for a few minutes as you're watching today. John chapter 11, verse 1-44. Let me unpack it for you. There's two women in Jesus' life that were followers of him, and along with the disciples. There were others, but Mary and Martha are them, and we know you may know some of the stories of Mary and Martha. Jesus goes to their home, and Martha's busy making a meal, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, and there's a whole thing that happens there. But Mary and Martha had a brother named Lazarus, and they lived in the village of Bethany. Jesus was very close to this family. In fact, I think that he loved them so much they were like family to him. And Lazarus, in this John chapter 11, becomes sick. So his sisters sent for Jesus, hoping that he would come right away, expecting that if Jesus came right away, he could heal Lazarus and they could go back to life as normal. When Jesus hears it, being God in the flesh, it's as you read the story, it's revealed to him that Lazarus' sickness would not end in death, but that God's purposes would be accomplished. Now keep that in mind. So Jesus stays 2 more days where he is in that place, and then he goes to Bethany. On the way, Jesus has another revelation, and he tells his disciples, Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. Jesus knows that Lazarus is dead, and he tries to explain to the disciples that Lazarus' death is temporary, though they didn't understand at the time. Jesus arrives at the edge of Bethany and finds out that Lazarus is dead. In fact, he's already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, for the Jewish people at that time, they had this belief that the soul would hang around for 3 days, but on the fourth day, that person was dead. There was no chance. So everyone knew, there was no question in anyone's mind who was there that Lazarus was dead. And Mary and Martha then were surrounded by many Jews who had come to Bethany to mourn with them. Imagine this. Unlike oftentimes in funerals that we'll go through, it's very quiet and somber, and some may cry, but most try to hold back their emotions. In this situation, for the Jewish people, there would have been loud wailing, crying, them beating their chests in grief, inconsolable weeping taking place. And both Martha and Mary come to Jesus and they ask him, "Why didn't you come sooner?" And we know from reading it that Jesus was intentional about what he did. He even waited for Lazarus to be dead so that through this experience, he could teach them who he really was and that they would have faith in him to be the overcomer of death and the giver of life. And he, being God in the flesh, knew that Lazarus was about to be resurrected here. And in the verses that follow this passage, that is exactly what he does. He calls Lazarus out of the grave and he comes back to life. But before that happens, something takes place here that gives us some insight into Jesus' humanity and helps us with grief. Verse 33 to 38 says this: When Jesus saw her weeping, talking about Mary, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And then it says, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could he not have opened the eyes of who had opened the eyes of the blind man, had kept this man from dying?" And then it says, Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. Jesus here is deeply moved at what's happening. In the language that's used here for Jesus, there's almost an anger at death that Jesus has. And the words used almost talking about like a snort from an animal. There's this indignation that Jesus has. He's outraged at death and what's taken place and the grieving that's happening at this moment. And he is troubled by it all because of what he is watching, and he's empathetic. He's affected with great pain and sorrow to the point of agitation. And Jesus begins to weep, full of emotion, even though, keep this in mind, he knows that Lazarus is about to come back to life. The words used here for Jesus' response are charged with emotions, indignation, anger, agitation, sadness, by the grief of his friends and the power of death over humanity. Jesus felt all the emotions associated with grief and loss and what might have been. And that's why the writer in Hebrews, in chapter 4, verse 14 to 16, is able to write this. "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." Let me remind you today, God knows about grief. Whatever grief that you are experiencing in your life or you're working through at this time or will in the days to come if something happens, God understands. He knows how you feel. So to help us today, we're going to answer this next question. How do we handle family grief and loss, whatever the reason for it? I want to share with you 3 quick things. First is this. Give yourself time to grieve. Even Jesus wept. John chapter 11, verse 35. As you go through grief, honestly acknowledge the grief that is there, the emotions, and don't feel guilty about them. Grief is a natural thing that we have to go through. It's a human response, and it's not healthy for us to suppress it. And I want to tell you today, there is no quick fix or cheat codes to bypass grief. We have to just work through it. And let me say this today, that's okay. In grief, you may experience shock and sadness, anger, fear, loneliness, helplessness. You may even be impacted physically with weakness and nausea, insomnia. You'll feel times as you go through the stages of denial of what took place, or anger and guilt, or bargaining that if I had just done something differently, this wouldn't be the way it is, and depression, all of that you may go through till you get to the place of one day accepting what's taking place. I shared earlier that Sonny and I have a family member we're working through grief with, and this whole idea of not having them in our lives. And every time I look at their picture in my house, those feelings of grief come back again at the loss that I'm experiencing. And that's okay. I like what the University of Washington Counseling Center says. Relax your expectations of how you should grieve and give up your need for control. Just walk through it. Give yourself time to grieve. Secondly, work through the why and the tension of no answers. Job asked the question after he has lost everything, and there's this story in the Old Testament where Job is this man who is a good man. He's a man who loves God, and through a certain series of situations, he loses everything. And in Job chapter 7, verse 20, this is not the first time, but one of the occurrences, Job says, God, why have you made me your target? He asks that why question. It's natural for us to ask the questions while we're grieving. But we do have to be careful about asking the questions where there are no answers. As we go through grief, there is the temptation to question God's character, or even to question our own. We'll have doubt. We may feel guilty. We may have envy towards others who have what we don't have. We may feel this self-pity or even become bitter, and we need to guard ourselves. And we have to learn how you and I best live in the tension of not having the answers in this life, and that it's okay to not know why. And it's even okay to wrestle with our faith while we're experiencing grief, but we need to not give up. As we work through that, a couple other things that we can do that will help us is working towards an attitude of thankfulness, and in looking and seeing the things that we do have. If it's a family member that you've lost, whether it's estrangement or they've passed away, too often we neglect the other family members in our lives because we're so overwhelmed with grief. We need to be thankful that we have those people in our lives. The other thing that can help us as we work through this is talking it through with others who are empathetic and encouraging. Just a number of weeks ago, as we were sitting with another couple of pastors, Sonia shared our story with them about what we were going through with the estrangement and a family member. And I don't open up as easily at times, but as she shared that, and it felt a little uncomfortable for me at the time, there was this connection that we made with this couple, and we had the opportunity as we were with them to pray together about that situation and for us to pray for them. I like what Dr. Maury Joseph says. Only when we give up trying to know what we can't know in advance, can we make our minds available to experience life? We can get so tied up in the why that we never get over that, and we have to come to the place where we can live in the tension of no answers. I think the third thing that will help us is this: walk with Jesus because he's walking with you. There's an interesting story that we find in Luke chapter 24, and I'll read verse 32 in a moment, where Jesus has died and the resurrection has happened. And there's these two disciples, from what we understand, that are walking along the road to Emmaus. And Jesus suddenly appears, comes alongside them and is walking with them, but they don't recognize that it's him. And he sort of says, "What are you talking about? And what's all of this about?" And they sort of respond like, do you live under a rock? Have you not heard what's happened in Jerusalem? And they tell Jesus the story of what's happened, of his own death and the loss. And there's this talk of resurrection, but there's this idea where they just don't understand. And Jesus responds to them as he listens to them tell this story, and he knows. He could have easily appeared and said, "Here I am, I'm risen, I'm right here." But he listens to their story and their experience, and then it says he talks to them and explains to them through the scriptures, trying to help them to understand what has happened and what's taken place. Later, as they travel, they invite Jesus to stay with them for a meal, and it says, as they began to break bread, they recognized it was Jesus, but then he disappeared. And they say this after, in Luke 24:32. It says this: they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Instead of Jesus just appearing and saying, "Here I am," we don't need to have this conversation. He walks with them, listens to them, and then explains to them what's happening. And it reminds us today that God is always with us. He is always extending grace and compassion and comfort and mercy to us. He is there with us, walking with us. And our response when we're going through grief is really just to acknowledge that and choose to walk with him as he's with us, walking with us. Part of that, like any relationship, is spending time together. And so it's so important as we're grieving that we take time to pray. Doesn't mean it's a lot of words. Sometimes it's just the thoughts and our prayers to him of what we're feeling at the time. It's important for us to read the scriptures, sometimes maybe just a few verses that we can meditate on. Jesus is with us to help us through our grief. The other part to this is that let others walk with you. Let others come alongside you who will just be there. If you, and I can say this today, if you know someone who's going through grief in their life and they've shared that with you, you don't have to say a lot. You just really need to be there with them, to sit with them, to bring comfort, to serve them through their sadness, and encourage them to keep walking. We have lifelong friends that really we became friends, early on in our marriage, so almost 30 years ago that we met. And we connected, we had fun times together and great times. In fact, they're coming to see us in a couple of weekends from now again. They live in BC. But when we went through our miscarriage or a first pregnancy, I remember, and I've told this story before, but I remember that they just called us up and they said, "Can we come over and bring a meal?" And they did that. They came over and they just sat with us and listened, and we chatted, and they ate with us. And about last year or the year before, we went to visit them in BC, and I remember sitting with them, and we talked about that situation. And Sylvia, who is the wife, she asked this question: was that kind of weird or awkward for us to do that at that time? She said, "I kind of felt uncomfortable. I wasn't sure if we should do it. Was that sort of weird for you guys?" And we said, "Absolutely not. That was one of the best things that you could have done." And we can do that for others. Walk with them. As you're walking through this, you may really need to seek help from a doctor or a Christian counselor as needed, who also will walk with you. And I like the promise that we have in the name of God, which is Emmanuel, meaning God with us. And Solo Parent Blog, in talking about grief, says this: God with us in grief doesn't mean he comes and gives back whatever we lost. Rather, he redeems us where we are now, where we are going. He gives us a richer understanding of who he is. I want to finish with this thought. In the midst of our grief, there's a new hope. I like what Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and talking about writing to the followers of Christ there about death and resurrection. He says, "We do not grieve like the rest of humankind who have no hope." If we are a follower of Christ today, we have hope, even in the midst of grief, in the middle of grief. Isaiah 61:3 says this, and I like these verses because it's in chapter 61, verse 1 and 2, there's the Isaiah, who's the prophet, writes these words about the Messiah who would come and his mission. And it's later in Luke that Jesus stands up in the local synagogue and reads those verses and says, "Today this is fulfilled." And really, it's his mission. And verse 3, I think, really continues what his mission that he had come to do. And it says this: "To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. And in their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his glory." I like those verses because they remind us that even as we go through grief, there is hope. And that God comes along to walk with us, as we talked about, through these things and to help us. But he is there for us, and he will one day turn those ashes of, and in the scriptures in the Old Testament, when they were mourning, oftentimes they would kind of roll themselves in ashes and put ashes on themselves. And he's depicting this. He's saying a crown of beauty instead of ashes. A joyous blessing that God will bring to us to replace the mourning. Festive praise to replace the despair. And he plants us for his own glory, even through those things that we experience. So when we're grieving, in the midst of our grief, in the midst of your grief, whatever it is that you are grieving today that is on your mind, we celebrate that we have hope and we have eternity. One day, even though we don't know the why today, one day we will know the answers. One day when we stand with Christ, when we leave this earth and when we pass from this life ourselves and others will be behind in grieving, we will know and understand. God brings us hope. We also, in the midst of this, because of this hope, we can give comfort to others as we are healing. I can pretty much guarantee that as you grieve and go through things and God helps you through that, and as you rely on him and others to walk with you through it, I guarantee you will meet people who will have gone through similar things or something like it that you can relate to or you can empathize with. That is no accident that happens. Because I believe that as God does healing in us through the grieving, he uses that to help others that he brings along our path so that we can walk with them and help them to experience this new hope. Whatever you're grieving today, don't forget, I want to remind us, I can't say it enough, God is with you and he wants to help you. And I want to pray for you today as we finish. Father, I thank you today for your amazing love for us. Lord, I think of those who are watching right now and the grief that they are experiencing in their lives. And I know that you understand what they're going through. You know exactly all of the details. You know what is breaking their heart at this moment. And maybe there's tears rolling down their face at this moment because their heart is so hurt. And that wound that is open and it's raw that's there. God, I pray that you would reveal yourself to them today, your love for them. I pray that maybe if they're watching today, if they're not in relationship with you, or they're on the edges of faith today, God, maybe at this moment, this will be for them that moment to reach out to you. And I thank you that your promise is that if we draw near to you, you will draw near to us. In other words, if we turn to you, you're right there. And God, I pray that those who are watching today would experience that. Lord, if we're followers of you today and going through grief in our lives, God, would you bring healing? Would you walk with us as we go through the grief that we're going through in these circumstances that we're experiencing in our lives, and bring healing to us? I pray that our hearts would begin to hope again and to know, God, that in the spite of not having all of the answers, we can trust that you are a good God and that you are with us and you will help us through it. God, I pray if they haven't already experienced it, that Lord, you would bring people across their path who would help them, that would support them. It wouldn't be about saying things as much as they would just be about being with them today. And God, we thank you for this. And I thank you today for what you're going to do as you bring healing and hope again as we grieve and work through grief. And we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.